the GB Divide adventure has come to an end. A great adventure with lots of challenges along the way and lots of memories made, but today we will be taking a look at how I set up the bike and all the gear I used along the way. So let's jump into it. Let's start with the bike itself. The frame is a titanium Sonder Camino in 60 centimeters. This is the first gen iteration, which means it uses a quick release on the rear, not a through axle. The fork is a Selkoff carbon fork from Planet X, which is a 12mm through axle, and the headset is from Hope. The seat post is some cheap post from System X. I'm not a fan of using a nice seat post on bikes that I find myself running saddlebags often on, so this gets the job done nicely. And the saddle is a Pro Logo saddle that I can't remember the exact model of, but I've been using Pro Logo saddles for a while now and I get on with them well. The stem is a Dida 110mm stem, nothing too fancy there. The bars are the Ritchie Venturemax 44 centimeters that I'm not actually that keen on. I find that the little bump in the drops actually tires my hands as it adds more pressure when on the brakes and descending. So I'm probably going to be changing these soon. These bars are wrapped in fabric bar tape that desperately needs changing, but I hate starting long rides on new bar tape, and I like it to be a bit worked in before I set off. So now I'm back, that will be getting changed too. I also opted to stick the TT bars on for this ride. These are some Profile Design T2 plus D2 alloy clip-on bars with the 70mm Profile Design riser kit. These were fairly useful on a ride like this, however they got most of their use in Scotland and not a whole lot of use elsewhere. Scottish roads and trails were mostly long and flowing and not overly steep, so you could spend a bit of time on them to take off that pressure from your hands and get out of the wind if you needed to. Apart from the section from Manchester to Wales and the Somerset levels, you won't get much time on the TT bars, as lots of Wales and the southwest is where you find all the steeper trails, and you of course need to have quick access to your brakes. So that's the frame and the cockpit, so let's take a look at the components. And if you watch the videos of this ride, you will know that about halfway I managed to break the rear mech and rear wheel, which meant then I decided to go home and get my other bike, but then due to trains being cancelled I had a slightly longer wait and therefore decided to fix the bike up as much as I could and continue with the Sonder. So I will start with how I originally set this bike up. The brakes, shifters and rear mech were all SRAM Force 1x with a 1042 cassette, 175mm SRAM Rival cranks with a 42 chainring. So 42 was my easiest gearing. This is on the slightly stiff side for a ride like this, and I'd probably opt for a 40 or a 38 chainring if I wanted to give myself the best chance to ride everything. The wheels were a DT Swiss Spline 1850 rear wheel and a Halo white line front rim built onto an SP Dynamo hub. Both of these wheels were set up tubeless with Maxxis Ramblers 50mm tyres. I've been using these tyres for a while now and I really like them. The bigger tyre size means I can really enjoy the rough descents and grip well on the technical climbs. They are slightly slower on the road, but they roll good enough that it doesn't feel like you are dragging your bike along. I had no issues with these tyres and had no punctures, so like I said, a couple things changed after getting to Wales. The Force rear mech was replaced with a cheap Apex rear mech, and to make my life easier I put my spare wheels on. The rear wheel, a Reynolds Carbon AR41 and a Reynolds Assault carbon rim built onto another SP Dynamo hub for the front. I've had this rim for absolutely ages now. It is the rim that I rode the entire British coast with and it's still going strong. Both these wheels were already set up and ready to roll. They had a much narrower tyre on. The Schwabe G1 bites in 14mm, and although I had no issues with these tyres for the remainder of this trip, they were definitely on the harsher side of things coming through some parts of Wales. They do roll very well on the road, which definitely helped on the final push to the end, but definitely meant taking things a bit easier on the rough descents. Right, so that's the bike. but I know some of you will want to know about keeping things charged. So like I said, I used a Dynamo hub on this trip. I'm using this for the lights, which are the Exposure Revo front light, which then powers the rear light, which is the Exposure Red Eye. With the time of the year, I did this ride in early March, and with the shorter days, I wanted to just run lights 24/7, and these worked great, especially useful the further south I got on some of the Devon and Cornish back lanes in the rainy weather. I was also using the Dynamo to charge the Garmin 830, which was what I was using for mapping, via the Synwave Revolution. I'm running both of these at the same time into the Dynamo hub and have done this lots over the years, and am always able to produce enough power to keep the Garmin charged and lights shining. I also carried two 10,000 milliamp power banks. One of these was for camera batteries and one as a backup for charging my phone. However, the first time I actually charged my phone was not until the night I got to the Welsh border, so I didn't really need it. I managed that by only turning my phone on maybe once a day to let some people know where I got to. Right, it's time to take a look at what I was carrying and how I was carrying it. Let's start with the frame bag. This is the Blackburn Outpost Elite frame bag in a medium short size, which fits this Sonder perfectly for the way I wanted it, leaving room for the water bottle on the seat tube. This bag is pretty much just used for food, and this size is the 3.65 litre version, and I can get enough food in there for 2 to 3 days of riding. I like this setup, no annoying trying to get bottles to fit around the frame bag, and there is plenty of space inside. The only downside with this bag is the zips. They are not that easy to open and close. You may remember I used to have this bag in a bigger size before, that ended up getting sent back and refunded because the zips broke. So we will see if the zips survive on this one. The top tube bag is the Lifeline bag, the larger option of the two. This has been on my bike for about 2 years now, and it did unfortunately finally break on this trip, with the stem strap breaking off. This bag was used for keeping most of the maintenance things in, a couple of tubes, some tyre boots, tubeless plugs, and a pump, that sort of thing. The two stem bags, again, these are pretty old now, but they are the Podsax bags. One of these was just kept empty and used for stashing my gloves in or rubbish, and the other holds my water filter in, the Catatin B3, 0.8 litre version. Definitely worth grabbing yourself a water filter if you want to stay out longer and not to have to rely on pubs and cafe stops. While we're on the subject of water, the only bottle I carried was an Elite 950ml water bottle, which did have a nice handy lid to keep the crud off. However, somewhere along the trail, this must have broken off. I have no idea how or where, but it was annoying because that's the only reason I brought that bottle. Just filling this up along the way with the filter was easy, and I never found myself running out. There was always somewhere to refill from. The front bag is the Ortlieb 9 litre bar roll bag, and in this bag is where I keep the tent, which is the Alpkit Soloist extra large version. The tent poles strap to the outside of this bag. I've been using this tent for a while now, and it's definitely seen better days, but it's still keeping me dry. It's fairly light and packs down nicely. On this trip, I did also take a tarp with me, just a cheap no-name tarp, just in case I wanted some shelter at any point on this trip. But I ended up just stomping through the miles when the weather was wet and miserable, so I ended up just using this tarp as a ground sheet. I actually broke this bar roll bag on this trip. It was definitely a trip for breaking everything, hey? That's for sure. The strap that attaches around the head tube broke, the hold on the bag. Luckily there are more than one, but still, another breakage. The rear saddlebag is the Topeak Backloader 10 litre, and in here is where I keep everything I need to keep dry. Spare clothes and the sleeping bag. The sleeping bag I used on this trip is the Alpkit Pipe Dream 400, a 3-season down sleeping bag with a limit of around -6. This is the bag I use for probably most of the year in the UK, minus the few months of warm we get. It's been great and it packs down nice and small. I think in this trip the coldest it got was -1 or -2, and I was always toasty warm. I also carried my very old and trusty down jacket, a high gear jacket I brought for about 50 quid 5 to 6, 7 years ago. I don't use this to ride in, but just while I'm in the tent. A spare pair of Altura bib shorts and a spare long sleeve t-shirt, and my warm thermal socks that I sleep in. In total, I had 6 pairs of socks, 3 basic fin pairs, then 3 of these trail running socks made by 1000 Miles. These are great socks for the colder and wetter months. So that's everything on the bike, so let's go over what I wore while riding. Let's start at the bottom, the shoes. The shoes I wore were the Shimano ME7, and yes, they are falling apart, but they were already falling apart before I started this ride. I decided to give them one more outing, and they made it. Just about. You may have noticed me riding in trousers the last few videos, and that was just to try and keep the bibs and leg warmers underneath a little cleaner, while the trails are nice and wet. The trousers are the Rock Riders, all mountain from Decathlon, and although these are pretty comfortable to ride in and they are water resistant and do a good job of keeping what's underneath clean, I can't really recommend them for longevity. They had started to get their first hole after the 3rd time I wore them, and well, by the end of this trip they are just falling apart. Underneath the trousers were some nuke-proof cargo bib shorts and some DHB merino leg warmers. The top I was wearing for most of this journey is one that you will always see me riding in. It is a Movelo Overland Tech Tee. It's just such a good top. It's incredibly fast drying, it's lightweight and packs down small. Unfortunately, Movelo don't seem to sell them anymore, but if you can find them, definitely pick one up. Casual enough to wear every day, but just really functional while out riding. The waterproof jacket that if you are a regular viewer of this channel, you will have seen me in it many times, and was certainly needed for the final half of this trip. The jacket is the Patagonia Torrential 3 layer, and it's just a great jacket. Even at the end of a day after non-stop rain, I was dry underneath. The jacket has pit zips, which are really nice to help with ventilation and work really well while cycling. Although the jacket isn't designed specifically for cycling, the hood is just about big enough to get over your helmet. It's also just a really great jacket for keeping the wind off you while you are up high. I've had it a couple years now and it's still a solid jacket. The gloves was actually something I changed when I returned home to fix the bike. When I set off, I was using these Decathlon Weds gloves. They're a cheap, lightweight ski glove, but for how cheap these gloves are, I find them really good for the colder days of cycling. However, I managed to tear these while pulling out a tent peg on the first day, and then every morning I did the same thing over and over again. So when I went home to change the bikes, I switched up the gloves and I finished the ride with my Dakine Gore-Tex ski gloves. I don't really rate these that high as I find them less warm than the cheap Decathlon ones. The dexterity isn't that great, and the claim that they are waterproof just hasn't held true. I haven't used them Decathlon ones in any rainstorms, so I'm not sure how they would have fared either. The bag I was wearing along this trip was really just there because of the camera gear. The bag was the Alpkit Skytrail. I would rather not wear the bag, but needs must for the tripod, drone and the batteries. The bag is, however, quite comfortable, but does let in some water on the days where the rain doesn't stop. The only other thing I did carry in here was some of the personal hygiene things, the toothbrush, bit of deodorant, that kind of thing. Oh, and of course, the space blanket. Well, there we go. That is everything I took on the GB Divide and how I set the bike up. If you want to see any of this stuff in a bit more detail, check the video description for the first look and final 4 videos. Hope you enjoyed this little series of the GB Divide, and until next time, keep smiling, enjoy the adventure.